I've been a fan of the Naughty Dog games ever since I was a little kid, except unlike most people, my enjoyment with these games didn't end when the credits rolled. I've often felt like the Naughty Dog multiplayers have been underrated, and while much of that is due to other aspects such as marketing, I can't help but feel that there are a few things that Naughty Dog could take notes on going into Factions 2. Much of my childhood was based on playing the multiplayer components of Uncharted 2, 3, and Last of Us. Hell, that's how I built up my channel, and I've been able to see the community expand and change and grow in many different ways. And while I'm truly grateful for that, I only want to see their future work be the very best that it can be. If you don't remember, or perhaps weren't around, back in 2015, Broken Games HD and Robin Gaming both made videos addressing the problems the community had with Uncharted 3's multiplayer in an attempt to get Naughty Dog to listen going into Uncharted 4. In fact, this inspired me to make a similar video which I released over 2 years ago, where I discussed the problems I had with Uncharted 4 multiplayer going into The Last of Us Part 2s. Well, I was going through a few of my old videos and was talking about those games with a few friends, and we came to the conclusion that there are a lot of things that they can learn from all of their multiplayer games in general. Naughty Dog's upcoming standalone multiplayer title, often referred to as Factions 2, has been in development in some form since 2017, and if recent job listings are to be believed, if there's a time to get our voices out there, it's now. Now, it's important to understand what this video is. This video is solely focused on the mistakes of the past Naughty Dog multiplayer games and what they should do differently with Factions 2. I have many desires and wishes for what the contents of this multiplayer project turns out to be, but that is out of the scope for this video and will be saved for a more appropriate time. A little terminology also before we begin. I'm going to refer to Naughty Dog's next multiplayer project as Factions 2, since that's what most people address it by. In reality, everything we know about this project makes me think that it'll be more in the universe of the world of Factions, with maps and content possibly coming from both the first and second game. I could see this game being what Apex Legends was, a standalone multiplayer title set in the Titanfall universe, just this time with The Last of Us. Again, I'll tackle my hopes for the content of this multiplayer game in a later video, so look out for that, but with that being said, let's revisit where it all started.
And we just got it. Yeah, we just got it yesterday. Yesterday, and we're gonna start.
Released on October 13, 2009, arguably one of the biggest titles for the PS3 dropped, Uncharted 2 Among Thieves, also my personal favorite game of all time. A sequel to a game many considered good, but nothing special. While the game was a massive improvement overall, it also included Naughty Dog's first ever attempt into the multiplayer space, really, and looking back, it kinda is hard to believe how much they got right. When I think of Uncharted 2, the first thing that comes to my head is basic and even. Everyone started with the same weapons and had to fight for more powerful weapons in the middle of the map. With Uncharted 2, you had a real sense that they put gameplay first and everything else came second. They didn't have any BS really going on to the side of things. Everything was just smooth and people had a lot of fun with it. The maps that they introduced became iconic maps over the next two multiplayers, and yeah, there's something to be said about Village, Sanctuary, and Trainwreck, and the list goes on. How they even added things like Cinema Mode and the introduction of the lab, which would be later introduced more heavily in Uncharted 3, and it's kind of surprising to consider all of this started back in 2009. Co-op came in the form of Arena, Siege, and Adventure, and really it started a basic template for what eventually would become a better multiplayer with Uncharted 3. In fact, I still sometimes prefer to play Uncharted 2. There's just something special about it. Of course, no multiplayer isn't without its faults. Uncharted 2 was its first attempt, and with that, multiplayer lobbies could not be joined mid-progress. If people left the games, you often had abysmal games where it'd be 2 versus 3 or 4 versus 1. It really got out of hand. While Uncharted allowed you to choose quite a bit of perks, many people just ran the same perks. Perks like situational awareness and fleet foot were quite the norm. And perks like revenge just left a bad taste in players' mouth, as it just dropped a grenade upon death and was often seen as a cheap way to get a kill when you died. These minor complaints were also really annoying, but nothing really tops the changes that they made after Uncharted 2 launched. The health state changed dramatically in a post-launch update that dramatically reduced the health to similar games like Call of Duty. Uncharted 2, in my opinion, felt a lot better to play when you had more health, considering the type of multiplayer and slow-paced gameplay that it introduced. Ultimately, what can you say about Uncharted 2? It's a great first step. Support was even there with DLC maps covering Drake's Fortune, which obviously didn't have a multiplayer mode, and yeah, the patches were controversial, but they did still support it post-launch. Ultimately, I love Uncharted 2 multiplayer. I wish I could still go back to it, and it was just a great stepping stone to Uncharted 3. With more experience behind their belt this time around, Naughty Dog developed an even better multiplayer with Uncharted 3. For starters, the core gameplay became much faster paced, as you can now sprint. Gameplay matches became a lot more exciting because of this, as higher kill games were now possible. Alongside this saw a suite of customization options not only on the cosmetic side, but also on the player's loadout. These changes, obviously influenced by the biggest multiplayer titles of that time, allowed for a greater sense of expression as players were able to make more choices than ever before. While Uncharted 2 had a variety of modes, Uncharted 3 took this to the next level, adding even more modes. This, accompanied with the prestige system, really gave players a reason to play besides the addicting gameplay loops. But of course it'd be dumb to overlook the commercial decisions that also happened. Uncharted 3 multiplayer became free to play, greatly increasing the audience, and was one of the first games on console to do so. Of course, it wasn't all positive. The core philosophy at catering towards the casual audience that I briefly hinted at in Uncharted 2 became way more apparent in Uncharted 3. Situational awareness and revenge were back and bigger than ever before. New systems such as power plays and kickbacks made it clear that Naughty Dog saw their multiplayer as a casual sport. But look, I myself don't even consider myself to be a competitive player, but when I'm playing I also want it to be fair. I think you can add dynamic elements to your game without literally spawning an RPG in a player's hands, and as we'll see later with Uncharted 4, NPCs. Ultimately, Uncharted 3 was the pinnacle of the Uncharted community. There were so many great decisions made despite being bogged down by balancing issues and odd systems. I think if you would have combined the fair systems of Uncharted 2 with the amazing support we saw with Uncharted 3 and the variety of content, you couldn't have really asked for more. Having been announced literally a week before release, the Last vs. Factions mode was the biggest surprise no one saw coming. In a lot of ways, Factions feels a lot like Uncharted 2's multiplayer did to me. It is simple, plays great, has a few but very solid modes, and a variety of maps and level layouts. The support was also decent. If you take into account that many of Uncharted 3's maps added post-launch were just revamped versions of Uncharted 2, the numbers look pretty similar. Of course, Factions sadly faltered in some ways as well, especially when it came to DLC. Obviously, map packs were accustomed to the times as we saw that with the previous Uncharted multiplayers, but now weapons were also being locked behind paywalls, as well as cosmetic individual items. With Factions 2, I'd love to see better progression paths, and as we already saw with Uncharted 4, we most likely will get that. The leveling system, while simple, could also use some feedback in terms of progression. I still have friends to this day that don't understand how it works, and that should never be the case. With Factions, why I've been so excited and remain excited for Factions 2 is the potential. Factions was made in an environment where Naughty Dog didn't know how it would be received, and thus going forward we could see some very exciting additions now that the team understands the community and the appetite for this online mode. Co-op deserves a video in its own right, but it's worth quickly mentioning here how the original team wanted to but just didn't get around to it. We saw with the Left Behind DLC how the dynamics between the infected and survivors could be very cool, and obviously having played part 2 now, they utilize those kind of scenarios greatly. Just imagine that on a co-op or even PvPvE scale, and man, you have something special. Regardless, as I said earlier, the discussion of the contents of Factions 2 will be saved for a later time, but I'll leave you with this. Factions is probably the multiplayer to this day I have the least issues with. I still come back to it to this day and have a lot of fun with it. Yes, there are some balancing issues, and to this day people still want the game to be patched on Reddit, but honestly the game is really good at its core. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the most recent multiplayer and probably the biggest reason why this video exists in the first place, and probably going to be the longest part of this video. If there's one word that comes to my mind whenever I think back to the Uncharted 4 multiplayer, it's potential. After covering the game for so many years, from 2011 to 2016, I desperately wanted it to be good, and in many ways it was, but in many more ways it wasn't, especially coming from the past games. As always, the bones are great and the game felt amazing to play. I'd even argue that in terms of balancing, it was probably better than Uncharted 3. Sadly, this is where my pros end and the gripes come into play. For starters, the game shipped with only 3 modes, TDM, Command, and Plunder, and while these 3 modes aren't exactly bad, when you consider the fact that none of them cater to solo players, it's honestly unacceptable. While The Last of Us felt really good in terms of team dynamics, Uncharted honestly didn't feel as good. Mystical, sidekicks, power weapons, etc., all of these components, while cool in terms of design and theory, completely ruined the flow of gameplay. The sidekicks became more of a nuisance than anything, and often left players open for free kills, or they just surely got in the way of combat. It would have been way better to keep the flow of gameplay as it was in Uncharted 3, but with Uncharted 4's gameplay mechanics. At launch, many aspects to the game were also missing. Despite being in every multiplayer mode up until now, there was no co-op, and while I understand trade-offs and decisions have to be made during game development, there's just no denying that it hurt having to wait over 6 months before we got something. Map voting was also very weirdly missed, often leading to the same few maps over and over again, remember Remnants? Now the developers gave a solid explanation that they didn't want matchmaking to take too long, but I think I could speak for the majority of us when I say that we would rather spend an extra 10 seconds if that meant the next 10 minutes were spent on a map we actually enjoyed. Cinema mode, a huge tool for content creators, sadly was also missing as well at launch. But by far the biggest thing had to be the fact that there was no leveling system, and to this day that boggles my mind how that was able to be shipped. The devs were vocal in the frustration they had with the leveling system the gaming industry has been accustomed to, but the solution isn't to rip out that reward system entirely unless you have a good alternative to put in place instead. Now, all these little things, besides the leveling system, weren't a deal breaker by any stretch of the imagination, but it just begs the question, why? Why so many weird little decisions? All of these add up, and if these can be avoided with Factions 2 at launch, we'll already be on a better path. The monetization for Factions 2 could also be improved from Uncharted 4 as well. I'm not going to come out and claim that there should be no microtransactions, as that is completely ridiculous, especially given the business model of free-to-play. But what I am asking, however, is for two things. 1, please do not lock new weapons behind a random chance, and 2, my god, don't add 5,000 color options like you did with Uncharted 4. Besides that, I honestly think Naughty Dog did a really good job with Uncharted 4's economy. Just make new weapons earnable alongside a progression path, or at the very least remove the random chance aspects to the gameplay rewards. The color thing is a nitpick, but that really padded out the customization rewards, and did so in such a cheap and annoying way. In terms of maps, I'm interested in making this a topic for a whole video on its own, but I'll address it quickly here. Uncharted 4's maps just felt very similar to me. You see this image right here? Is this Remnants? Island? Perhaps rooftops? Who knows? Honestly, who knows? I really missed the variety of map styles we had in the older Uncharted. Half of Uncharted 4's maps used the same 3-lane style prefab, and while I understand the need for a more structured and even map for a team-based multiplayer, the reintroduction of Trainwreck and Village later on reinforced to me that the new maps just felt very similar. Anyways, as I said, this can honestly just be nitpicking, but if you want me to expand on this in a future video, we could. Finally, the reason why I ended up dropping the game and many others was due to the fact that Naughty Dog just didn't listen to the community. The weird and frustrating beta phase rollout of Classic Mode confused many, and when it was teased for a return, the addition of mysticals and sidekicks were asked, as if they really had no idea how we felt or what we wanted. When the leveling system was eventually added in, at first they were private, completely disregarding one of the main purposes of them in the first place. I could go on and on about how dozens of streams would go by and they just wouldn't answer the questions we wanted, but I think I made myself clear at this point. Overall, Uncharted 4's multiplayer had potential, but was held back by bad decisions and a lack of listening to the community's wants and desires. If there's one thing I want Naughty Dog to take going into Factions 2, it's Uncharted 4's multiplayer. I wanted to enjoy the multiplayer for years with my friends. I really did, especially given the 5-year wait for it, but there were just too many things that killed it off from happening. Almost every single thing I talked about in this video can be boiled down to one sentence. Listen to the community. No matter what happens in the lead up to launch or hell even past launch, no game is defined by its opening hour. While it no doubt hurts it, we've seen time and time again the comeback story of a game, and that almost always happens when a development team is in a position where they can quickly adapt and respond to player feedback. I want to talk about the ecosystem that essentially Factions 2 will be launching in, because it's very different from what we saw back on the PS3, and in a way Uncharted 4 as well. Every single multiplayer release before now essentially existed with a tack-on multiplayer mode, when that was the normal. Given the rise in free-to-play games over the past few years, I believe Factions 2 should be free-to-play as well. Given the recent bombing of Destruction All-Stars, I hope that also means it's free to play, and not just free on PlayStation Plus for the first 2 months. But these things are often figured out well early in development and are largely out of Naughty Dog's hands, so I digress. Uncharted 3 going free to play was a great move back in the day on the PS3, and when most games hardly ever thought about doing so. It's clear that in today's climate, if you want to stick around and have a booming player base, the choice is pretty clear. Go free to play. Despite the tone of this video, I have a lot of faith in the talented team at Naughty Dog on pulling through. The team currently is very different from what it was just a few years ago, and new blood almost always offers fresh and different perspectives. While there are plenty of reasons to be worried, there are many things to commend them for already. Their choice to remove the multiplayer component in the hopes of expanding and fleshing out their ideas to the quality of their single player offerings is only something I can praise them for. I know it can get easy to get impatient, but as each day goes on, I'm glad they're taking their time, and I can only hope that they make their decisions with these past blunders in mind. A decade later, there is nothing I want more than to feel the same way I did when playing these multiplayers with my friends. Of course, game development isn't exactly an easy walk in the park, and while many things sound good on paper, many times you just never know until you prototype, and you often have to change course. I just hope that when you are having people playtesting your game and giving you feedback, that you consider not only the mass audience as a whole, but the core fanbase that will be returning to your game day in and day out for the years to follow, no matter how small or big the commercial success is. Well everyone, that's it for me. While I spoke of my personal experience and tried to give the community feedback as a whole, now it's your turn. Make sure to leave all your thoughts and personal experiences in the comment section down below and what you'd like to tell Naughty Dog. I'm going to be making many more videos going into the launch of Factions 2, so make sure to hit the subscribe button as well as that notification bell. This originally was supposed to be a big video filled with the contents as well, but really that's going to be its own video, so look out for that coming out in the next week or so. Yeah, besides that, thank you for making it to the very end of the video. If you liked it, make sure to hit the like button. That would really help the channel out a lot. And until next time, take care.